Hello, I'm Mayor William Wild, and I would like to welcome you to the Westland Police Awards ceremony for 2020. This ceremony is usually held in person and highlights and honors some of the outstanding police work that has been done by the Westland Police Department. Despite not holding this event in person, we still wanted a way in which to show that the police department has had a positive impact on the community. We hope that you take the time to witness these many incidents for yourself. 2020 coined a new term that we will remember for a long time to come, and that term is essential worker. Despite the fact that COVID concerns spread uncertainty and fear throughout the community, police and fire personnel remained committed to serving Westland and continued to report to work each day without hesitation. The police department did this with pride as they were aware that during these uncertain times, the community needed them more than ever. Please know that the work highlighted in this presentation is only a small example of the work that is performed by the Westland Police Department. We hope that you enjoy this presentation and hope that you'll continue to support your police department as you have in the past. Your support is invaluable to them and is needed now more than ever. Thank you and enjoy this year's Westland Police Award ceremony.
On January 3rd, 2020, a Superior Township resident made online arrangements to meet a potential buyer after listing his Apple iPhone online. The buyer and seller eventually agreed to meet in a business parking lot in Westland. Once the buyer arrived, the victim approached his vehicle and observed two males inside. As the victim began to display the phone from the passenger side window, the driver grabbed the phone from the victim's hand and the vehicle began to drive away. The victim attempted to keep hold of the phone, but the passenger grabbed the victim's hand, causing the victim to be dragged by the vehicle approximately 50 feet before he was able to break free. The victim was not injured and was able to provide the vehicle's license plate to the police, where it was entered in as a wanted vehicle. A few days later, Officer Trosper located the suspect vehicle and summoned Officer Schurig and Officer Munson to assist. Officer Munson, who was driving, activated their emergency lights and siren in an attempt to conduct a traffic stop on the vehicle and observed that 5 people were inside. The vehicle initially slowed, but then accelerated rapidly, failing to stop. The officers advised dispatch and responding officers that they were now involved in a high-speed pursuit with the wanted vehicle. The pursuit led officers into a residential neighborhood in Inkster, where the vehicle slowly came to a stop. At that time, 4 of the occupants fled on foot, and officers gave chase. Officer Schurig, who was the passenger, initially began chasing the suspects on foot, but quickly observed that there was one suspect still inside the vehicle. The remaining suspect jumped into the driver's seat and began to flee in the wanted vehicle. A second pursuit was initiated by Officer Schurig, as Officer Munson, Officer Trosper, and responding officers were still in an active foot chase. The wanted vehicle eventually struck a curb and the vehicle became disabled. This driver also fled on foot, but was apprehended moments later by Officer Trosper and Officer Munson. Responding officers were able to take a second subject into custody as well. Through Officer Schurig and Munson's investigation, they were able to identify the driver of the first pursuit, who was arrested by the Detroit Police Department the next day. The Wayne County prosecutor charged one of the suspects with fleeing elude, robbery, larceny, and resisting arrest. The second suspect was charged with fleeing elude and resisting, while the third suspect was charged with resisting and obstructing police. Due to their outstanding police service during this complex incident, Officer Schurig and Officer Munson and Officer Trosper are presented with the Westland Police Department Unit Commendation.
Each day, officers are faced with some element of danger. Some days, the danger is greater. Officers have to be prepared at all times for any situation that may arise. These situations can be vastly different and can unfold very quickly. In the early afternoon on January 22nd, 2020, officers of the Westland Police Department were dispatched to a bank robbery that had just occurred in the area of Wayne and Warren. Information came out to responding units that a black male wearing all black, a face mask, and a black, green, and red backpack pointed a handgun at the bank teller while demanding cash. The money was placed in the suspect's backpack and he fled the location on foot. While officers were actively investigating this armed robbery, dispatch advised that a second armed bank robbery just occurred at Warren and Merriman, just a few miles from the first location. The suspect description was given out, which matched that of the suspect from the first robbery. The suspect again used a firearm to acquire the money and placed same in the backpack. The suspect then fled the location on foot. Sergeant Fernie and Officer Hallis immediately responded to the area the suspect was seen heading towards. Almost immediately, they located a subject matching the description of the suspect in the neighborhood near the bank. Both Fernie and Hallis exited the vehicle at this time and began giving verbal commands to the armed suspect. The suspect then fled on foot as Sergeant Fernie and Officer Hallis gave chase. The suspect began fleeing through residential backyards. As the suspect emerged from a backyard, Lieutenant Farrar and an assisting Garden City officer were able to tackle the armed suspect to the ground. The suspect was actively resisting by way of kicking and pushing officers. In the midst of the physical confrontation, it was observed that the suspect had his hand on his firearm. Together and without incident, officers were able to disarm the subject, place him under arrest, and recover the evidence from the suspect's backpack. This was an outstanding effort by Lieutenant Farrar, Sergeant Fernie, and Officer Hallis, and because of their courageous actions, the armed and dangerous felon was safely apprehended with no injury to anyone involved. For their actions in this incident, Lieutenant Farrar, Sergeant Fernie, and Officer Hallis are awarded the Westland Police Department Departmental Citation.
Oftentimes, police officers are presented with individuals struggling with a wide variety of mental health crises. As first responders, officers are faced with these situations and oftentimes have to make swift decisions in order to save an individual's life within seconds or minutes of coming in contact with the individual. On March 1st, 2020, Night Shift A officers were dispatched to the Landings apartment complex for a 911 call of a suicidal 14-year-old. When officers arrived, officers observed the 14-year-old sitting at his kitchen table with a large, butcher-style knife pressed beneath his chin. Officers attempted to communicate with the subject in efforts to put the knife down with no avail. It was clear to responding officers that the juvenile was in both emotional and mental distress, and that their verbal skills alone were not going to resolve the situation. Within minutes of arriving on scene, Officer R. Schurig and Officer Tardif were able to devise a plan through nonverbal communication in order to not upset the juvenile. Officer Tardif was able to distract the juvenile via speaking to him, while Officer Schurig moved to his rear. Officer Schurig was then able to swiftly remove the knife from the boy's hand from behind him. During the disarming, neither the officers nor the juvenile were harmed in any way. Preceding this, the knife was removed from the scene, and officers, along with the boy's mother, were safely able to help him obtain the psychiatric intervention that he needed. Without Officer Tardif and Officer Schurig's quickly executed plan, there is no telling how badly the situation could have ended. For their swift actions on March 1st, 2020, Officer R. Schurig and Officer Tardif are both presented with the Westland Police Department Lifesaving Award.
On April 25th, 2020, Officer Pettit was dispatched to the Kroger store located at 31300 Michigan Avenue on a report of a car that had been broken into and that the items inside of the car had been stolen. Dispatch advised Officer Pettit on the way to his run that the suspect was a heavy-set black female driving a blue minivan. Officer Pettit spoke with the owner of the vehicle and ascertained that her phone, along with various groceries, had been taken from her car. Officer Pettit was able to ascertain that the phone had GPS tracking capabilities and quickly got to work tracking the stolen phone. After multiple attempts, Officer Pettit was able to track the phone to a party store located in Livonia. Officer Pettit quickly alerted other units to this new information, and Sergeants Compton,
14-3C, go ahead and
Reardon,
call it.
and
There's,
Kenyon
several cell phones
made their
on
way
this.
to the party store. Upon arrival at the party store, they located the blue minivan in the parking lot. They went inside the store and spoke with a female who matched the description, but officers still did not have enough with this vague description to assure that this female was the suspect involved in the larceny. Sergeant Reardon then stood outside the vehicle and requested that dispatch call the cellular phone that had been stolen. Upon doing so, a cellular phone in the vehicle began to ring. Officers were then able to connect the woman that they were talking to with the stolen phone, and subsequently also found the groceries that had been stolen in the vehicle as well. This incident not only brought a criminal to justice, but also quickly resolved a negative situation for an innocent victim. Shortly after this arrest was made, the phone and the groceries were returned to the victim. Due to this teamwork that quickly led to the apprehension of a criminal and police service that promptly returned stolen goods to the owner, Officer Pettit and Sergeants Compton, Reardon, and Kenyon are all awarded the Westland Police Department Unit Commendation Award.
In June of 2020, officers were dispatched to the Skygate Apartments for a report of a victim shot in the stairwell. Upon arriving on scene, officers were able to locate the victim in the north stairwell. The victim was lying in a pool of his own blood. The victim was able to advise the officers that he was shot by a female assailant who he held the door open for. He was able to give officers a decent description of the suspected shooter who fled the scene. Officers, knowing that the building was under constant surveillance, went right to management and were able to view the footage and get an exact description of the female shooter. Not only did they get the video footage, but they knew what vehicle the suspect was driving and what key card was used to access the parking lot. Through a name search, the officers were able to locate a known associate of the cardholder. That person was positively identified as the shooter. Officers queried the last known address of the subject and were able to locate her in another home in Westland. Officers went to the location and the suspect was arrested without incident. The suspect also still had the gun in her possession. The suspect later admitted to shooting the victim and was prosecuted for her actions. Although numerous other officers were involved in this case, Officers Sumter and Compton stepped up their investigative skills and were able to identify, locate, and apprehend the violent criminal. Due to their actions in apprehending the violent criminal, they are both awarded Westland Police Department citations.
There are often times in police work where split-second decisions have to be made in order to both preserve public safety needs as well as to preserve human life. On June 12, 2020, night shift A officers were faced with making several decisions that ultimately ended a very dangerous situation swiftly and in a safe manner. Officer Tardif, R. Shurig, Whitehouse, Plofchan, Garcia, Kozak, Guevara, Munson, Sergeant Jackham, and Lieutenant Swope responded to the intersection of Ford and Vinoy for several 911 calls of a vehicle that was doing donuts in the roadway. Upon arrival, officers observed a vehicle that was not only doing donuts, but had a fire that was forming in the engine compartment of the vehicle, and that was rapidly spreading throughout the vehicle. The driver of the vehicle continued to do donuts and had no intentions of stopping, despite several verbal commands given by Westland Police Department officers. Officers acted quickly and were able to both block the busy intersection off and devise a quick plan. Fearing for both the safety of the driver and the general public, Officer R. Shurig made the decision to position his patrol vehicle in a safe manner that would physically stop the inflamed vehicle from continuing to do donuts. Once the vehicle stopped, the fire continued to spread throughout the vehicle and the driver refused officers' verbal commands to exit the vehicle. At this time, Officer R. Shurig, Tardif, and Garcia were able to physically remove the driver from his fiery vehicle, despite his physical resistance and lack of compliance. The driver was eventually taken into custody without further harm to himself or the general public, and eventually was charged through the 18th District Court with OWI. For their quick actions and a well-devised plan on the night of June 12, 2020, Officers Tardif, Whitehouse, Plofchan, Garcia, Kozak, Guevara, and Munson, along with Sergeant Jackham and Lieutenant Swope, are awarded with the Westland Police Department Unit Accommodation Award. For their efforts in removing the driver from his vehicle that was aflame, Officers Garcia, R. Shurig, and Tardif are also awarded the Westland Police Department Lifesaving Award.
Police officers are constantly training throughout their entire careers. Some of that training is for high-risk, low-frequency incidents that some officers may not encounter in their entire career. On July 9th, 2020, officers were called to the Westland Mall on a report of a shooting that had occurred. Officers quickly responded at the scene and quickly relied upon their training. After receiving tremendous number of 911 calls and a great deal of witnesses exiting the mall with different stories, it was nearly impossible for the responding officers to be able to quickly develop reliable information. Due to this lack of reliable information, the responding officers were forced to make a decision, and erring on the side of safety, treated it as an active shooter situation. Officers entered the mall without hesitation and began moving toward the location where they believe that the shooting had occurred. They did so quickly with the intent of putting their own lives at risk to protect any innocent lives that may be threatened. Multiple officers approached the scene from multiple mall entrances and converged on the incident location, only to discover that the threat no longer existed in the mall at that time. Members of the Westland Police Detective Bureau conducted investigations and were able to locate and arrest the subject responsible for this incident. The Detective Bureau submitted a warrant to the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, which was approved for 15 felony counts, including assault with intent to murder, assault with an intent to do great bodily harm, and multiple counts of 4 other different weapons offenses. In hindsight, officers now know that the threat was no longer in the mall when they arrived. However, they initially responded they had no way of knowing if the suspect would be gone or if they were running into a life and death situation. Despite the significant risk to their own lives, each of these officers quickly relied upon their training and took immediate action to protect innocent lives. Due to their actions on this day, Officers Soulier, Sumter, Hallis, Gilbert, Munson, Gaddy, Guevara, Pettit, Aldini, Tardif, Kozak, Plofjan, Jovanovich, and Sergeants Compton, Reardon, Kenyon, Paris, Gaddy, Brassfield, and Sleep, and Lieutenant Novakowski are hereby awarded the Westland Police Department Unit Commendation.
As a police officer, we quickly learn that oftentimes things are not as they initially seem. In the early afternoon on July 16, 2020, Officer Neville conducted what he thought was a routine traffic stop of a speeding vehicle in the area of Middlebelt and Courier. Officer Neville's initial investigation resulted in the arrest of the driver for misdemeanor charges. The subject was placed under arrest without incident. It was at this time Officer Neville observed the vehicle to be riddled with bullet holes. The driver claimed he was victim of a drive-by shooting in which he never notified police of. Officer Neville's experience indicated to him that there may be more to the story, and he decided to investigate further. A search of the vehicle revealed a fully loaded .45 caliber handgun hidden in the glove box. Officer Neville learned that the handgun was stolen from a law enforcement agency in Texas. The case involving the stolen firearm was being handled by the ATF. Officer Neville again took his investigation one step further by reaching out to area departments regarding the vehicle and the fresh bullet holes. Detroit Police Department responded requesting the vehicle and suspect be held for their homicide unit. Detroit Police Department advised the suspect and vehicle were involved in a shooting in their city where a victim was shot with a .45 caliber handgun. Officer Neville conducted a thorough and efficient investigation, which as a result took a violent, armed, and dangerous subject off of the street without incident. Because of Officer Neville's diligence and efforts, he will be awarded the Westland Police Department Individual Commendation.
On August 15th, 2020, Westland police officers were dispatched to a residence on a report of assault. When officers arrived, they found the victim bleeding from the nose and observed that her eye was swollen shut. They also observed that she had several abrasions on her arms, legs, and knees. She informed officers that she was attacked by her neighbor, who punched her and kicked her in the face and stomach. She also stated that her actions caused her head to strike the pavement as she was falling to the ground as the result of the attack. The victim was transported to a local hospital where she was treated for injuries that required surgery. Officers attempted to locate the suspect shortly after the assault, but were unsuccessful. The following morning, patrol officers Compton, Hallis, and Hallis received information regarding the incident and began conducting follow-up to locate 3 suspects responsible for this heinous crime. They first located one of the suspects at his residence in Westland, placed him under arrest, and transported him to the station. They then received information that a second suspect was possibly at her mother's house in another jurisdiction. Officer Compton contacted the Michigan State Police to assist and located the second suspect. A short time later, Sergeant Reardon was dispatched to the third suspect's residence regarding an unknown trouble. Although the third suspect was not home, Sergeant Reardon spoke to the suspect over the phone, where he admitted to being involved in the original assault. After building a rapport with the third suspect, Sergeant Reardon convinced him to turn himself in at the Westland Police Department in a short time later, where he confessed to his involvement in the assault. Because of their thoroughness, determination, and initiative shown by Sergeant Reardon, Officer Compton, and Officer Hallis, all 3 suspects were taken into custody in less than 8 hours. The Wayne County prosecutor chose not to charge one of the suspects, but did authorize charges on the other 2, which included assault with the intent to do great bodily harm and aggravated assault. Due to their outstanding performance, Sergeant Reardon, Officer Compton, and Officer Hallis are awarded the Westland Police Department Certificate of Merit.
Each officer at the Westland Police Department has their own unique set of skills. One of the most important skills that an officer can possess is the ability to talk well and negotiate. Some officers excel in this area, and an example of this occurred in the evening hours of November 2nd, 2020. Officers were notified that a male subject had climbed to the top of a water tower located in the area of Newburgh and Palmer. Responding officers learned that the subject was suicidal and suffering from psychiatric issues. Shift officers attempted to speak with the subject, however, he refused to engage in constructive conversation. While officers were on scene, the subject began to cut himself on the leg with an unknown cutting instrument. Lieutenant Swope arrived at the scene and began gathering information and attempting contact with the subject via way of telephone. For 3 hours, Lieutenant Swope spoke on and off with the suicidal subject, who made numerous statements that his plan was to end his life. Lieutenant Swope observed the subject to be making phone calls from the tower, and each time he spoke with someone, he was becoming progressively more agitated. Lieutenant Swope felt the situation was being made worse by the outgoing phone calls. Lieutenant Swope facilitated for the subject's phone to be deactivated for outgoing calls, a decision that likely assisted in the subject's decision to come down. The subject agreed to come down, however, continued making comments that suggested he wanted to be shot by police. Even 3 hours into the negotiating, Lieutenant Swope continued to verbally de-escalate the situation and pled with the subject, who was oftentimes yelling and being irrational. After climbing off of the tower, the subject, who was armed with a box cutter, took an aggressive fighting stance. He was demanding police shoot him. Lieutenant Swope successfully distracted the subject, who was ultimately tackled for his safety, and he was taken into protective custody. Because of Lieutenant Swope's outstanding verbal de-escalation skills and his ability to negotiate, this situation was resolved peacefully, and the subject was able to get the psychiatric care that he desperately needed. As a result of his continuous efforts in this situation, Lieutenant Swope will be receiving the Westland Police Department Individual Commendation.
The Westland Police Department commonly utilizes its officers for specific purposes. For example, there's a school resource officer assigned to work with the school system, and community police officers who are assigned to work with citizens and resolve issues that they may be having. On September 13th, 2020, Officer Smith was assigned to enforce traffic laws on a hazardous driving enforcement detail. He did not realize that this day would quickly turn into much more than traffic enforcement. Officer Smith was in the area of John Hicks and Cherry Hill when he was alerted to an accident that had occurred near his current location. Officer Smith quickly volunteered to take the run and was the first officer on scene. He was alerted as that the driver was not responsive. Smith continued to monitor the driver's vital signs while he was still inside of the vehicle. After a short time, the driver's health deteriorated, and Officer Smith knew it was time to take action. Smith assisted the unconscious driver out of the vehicle and onto the ground, where he began CPR. A short time later, the Westland Fire Department arrived and transported the driver to the hospital. The quick actions that Smith took on this day sustained the driver's life long enough to receive desperately needed advanced medical care. Due to the Officer Smith taking these actions that prolonged the driver's life, Officer Smith is awarded the Westland Police Department Lifesaving Award.
On October 9th, 2020, Westland police officers were dispatched to a residence regarding an armed robbery that just occurred. While en route to location, dispatch advised responding officers that the victim had just been tied up and robbed. Officer Plofkin was the first to arrive in the area and observed a vehicle leaving the residence with its lights off. Officer Plofkin caught up to the vehicle and initiated a traffic stop on the vehicle. At that time, 3 suspects were taken into custody with the assistance of responding officers. While searching the vehicle, officers observed a large amount of evidence tying them to the crime, along with evidence that the suspects left at the scene. One of the garbage bags also contained the victim's phone that was found inside the vehicle. Officer Garcia arrived at the victim's house and found the scared residents inside. Officer Garcia conducted a thorough investigation at the scene of the crime and discovered that the victims were inside their garage when suspects kicked in the door and forced them on the ground at gunpoint before physically restraining them. Due to the nature of the crime and the evidence involved, detectives were called to the scene. Sergeant Brassfield, Sergeant Gazdecki, Sergeant Humphrey, Officer Tardif all assisted in the investigation with evidence collection. Sergeant Archambault also conducted a thorough investigation through evidence collection, several search warrants, and multiple interviews. Due to this team effort, all 3 suspects were charged by the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office for multiple felonies, which included charges for armed robbery, home invasion, unlawful imprisonment, and several gun-related crimes. Because of their efforts in this case, Officer Plofkin, Officer Garcia, Officer Tardif, Sergeant Gazdecki, Sergeant Humphrey, Sergeant Brassfield, and Sergeant Archambault are all presented with the Westland Police Department Unit Commendation.
On the morning of October 14th, 2020, Officer Pleer was observing traffic when he located a gray Dodge Dart and initiated a traffic stop. While on the traffic stop, the subject refused to get out of the car and later fled from the scene. While pursuing the vehicle, it was determined by Officer Pleer to be unsafe, and he terminated his pursuit. While returning to the station, Officer Pleer observed that the vehicle had caused an accident further down the road and went there to the area to assist with injured persons. When he arrived on scene, the suspect that he was attempting to stop earlier ran from the scene, and Officer Pleer gave chase on foot. He was able to tackle the suspect a short time later. While attempting to place the suspect in handcuffs, the suspect produced a handgun from his waist and attempted to point it at Officer Pleer. Pleer was able to push the barrel of the gun away from his chest, and the fight was on to gain control of the handgun. Officer Pleer was in a fight for his life, rolling back and forth with the subject. At one point, the suspect actually bit Officer Pleer's arm. While Officer Pleer was struggling to gain control, Officer Smith arrived on scene to assist. Now 2 officers were struggling to gain control of the suspect and the weapon. Officer Smith actually pulled his department-issued pistol to shoot the suspect, but decided that it was not safe to shoot the suspect while they were struggling with him, and did not want to injure himself or his partner. Officer Smith holstered his pistol and was able to deploy his taser, and after the second taser deployment, they were able to get the gun away from the suspect. At this time, the fight had been on for some time, and both officers were physically exhausted after fighting for their lives. They were able to hold the suspect down long enough for responding backup units to place the suspect under arrest. Both officers were treated for their injuries at an area hospital and released. The suspect was later charged with 17 felonies and sent to prison. For their heroic fight for each other's lives and in getting the armed suspect who intended on killing them under arrest and off the streets, Officer Pleer and Officer Smith are awarded Westland Police Department citations.
Nationwide, 2020 was a very challenging year for police officers. Across the country, it is often easy to lose sight of the true community support that police officers receive. I, Officer Chelfin, was reminded of the support on December 21st, 2020. While patrolling the Norwayne community, I observed a male tampering with a moped in what I believed was an effort to eventually steal it. After stopping to speak with the suspect began running down Grand Traverse on foot, and I pursued. As the foot pursuit continued onto Montcalm Court, I was eventually able to take the suspect to the ground in order to place him under arrest. At this time, I radioed for additional units, but a tussle between myself and the suspect ensued in order to take him into custody. At this time, civilian William Simmons, who was simply driving by in the area, saw my struggle with the subject and did not hesitate to jump into action to provide assistance. After a continued struggle, I was able to communicate with William and successfully place the suspect into handcuffs. The suspect was arrested for possession of methamphetamine, possession of prescription narcotics, resisting an officer, and his outstanding 18th District Court warrant. For his selfless actions with assisting me on December 12, 2020, with no hesitation, William Simmons is presented with the 2020 Citizen Award.
A Westland Police Department Unit Commendation is the performance of outstanding police services by any department unit or officers assisting said unit. On June 7, 2020, a homicide occurred and very little information was known about the circumstances. When the Westland Police Department Detective Bureau and Special Investigations Bureau are summoned out into a scene, it is full force team effort to bring a homicide suspect to justice. There's no better expression of teamwork than when bureaus coming together for one goal to solve a crime. Lieutenants and sergeants from these bureaus arrived on scene and were quickly updated with videos and proof of the homicide. Through search warrants and thorough investigation, the detectives were able to use numerous social media outlets to identify everyone involved in the homicide. Within hours of the homicide, all suspects had been identified and the search began. Detectives were able to track down the passengers in the vehicle that fled from the original scene. After interrogating those suspects, they eventually gave them the location of the shooter. When detectives located the shooter in Belleville, he knew the gig was up and attempted to flee on foot. He was later arrested in a vehicle he got into that was stopped by patrol officers. The Westland Police Detective Bureau and the Special Investigation Unit solved this homicide and had everyone in custody within 24 hours. These cases are shining examples of teamwork and the tenacity put forward to bring these suspects to justice. For their quickness, thoroughness, and commitment to bring murderers to justice, the Westland Police Department Detective Bureau and Special Investigation Unit are awarded a Westland Police Department Unit Commendation.
I'm Deputy Chief Brian Miller with the Westland Police Department, and I'm here today to present the Chief's Excellence Challenge Coin Award to Sergeant Nate McCrae. The Chief's Excellence Challenge Coin Award is awarded for outstanding contributions to law enforcement through the success of difficult police programs, projects, or situations, with such contributions being made at a high degree of professional excellence. Back in 2014, the Westland Police Department set out to become only the 6th police agency in Michigan to become nationally accredited through the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, also known as CALEA. This was no small undertaking, and we knew we would need to find someone who could manage this program and ensure that we would be successful in our endeavor. During his time at the Westland Police Department, Sergeant Nate McCrae had distinguished himself as an extremely hard worker who was well organized and had an understanding of the big picture and what accreditation could do for our department and our profession. Choosing Sergeant McCrae to become our accreditation manager was an obvious choice. Between 2014 and 2016, Sergeant McCrae worked to get almost 200 new policies and procedures into place and manage our accreditation process to make sure that these new policies addressed over 180 standards that were set forth by CALEA as industry best practices. Sergeant McCrae's countless hours of hard work paid off in April of 2016 when the City of Westland Police Department became internationally accredited through CALEA. With accreditation, the work does not stop once you receive your initial accreditation, and an agency must work just as hard, if not harder, to maintain their accreditation year after year. Sergeant McCrae continued to serve this department as our accreditation manager from 2014 all the way up to 2021. He did all of this while still managing his duties as a detective in our Detective Bureau. Although Sergeant McCrae has turned over his accreditation manager position, he still serves as a member of our accreditation team, where his experience and knowledge continue to serve this department. The positive effects that accreditation has had on this police department and this city will be realized for years to come. And as Sergeant McCrae closes out his role as accreditation manager, we wanted to recognize his service while in that position. For his outstanding contributions, I am honored to be able to present Sergeant Nate McCrae with the Chief's Excellence Challenge Coin Award. Congratulations, Nate.
Thanks, Chief.
Hello, my name is Jeff Jedrusik. I'm the Chief of Police of the Westland Police Department. At the end of each year, we review the accomplishments of our police officers. An accomplishment to us is not just numbers, but is consistent productivity, quality police work, professionalism, proactive work ethic, dedication to the city, and even compassion. The Westland Police Officer of the Year distinguishes himself by actions throughout the year. These actions far exceed the duty requirements expected of his position, both on and off duty. In 2020, there were many examples of great police work and many acts of heroism. There were several officers who were deserving of such an honor. Even though it was a tough decision, we feel that a single police officer distinguished himself above all others. For his accomplishments, we have selected Officer Robert Schurig as the 2020 Westland Police Officer of the Year. Officer Schurig is a proactive and productive police officer. He is a true leader who continues to represent us all well. He literally grew up in the Westland Police Department. He was a Westland Police Explorer for 5 years, and then was hired as a police service aide to learn the beginning stages of police work. Officer Schurig worked for the Auburn Hills Police Department for a year before returning to his roots in Westland. Officer Schurig has been serving as a Westland police officer for 6.5 years. I believe that Officer Schurig's direct supervisor summarized his work ethic best by saying the following. In today's day and age, the Westland Police Officer of the Year should epitomize all aspects of policing. As stated in our own mission statement, the City of Westland Police Department has a mission of providing excellent police services and working in partnership with the community, whether you are a resident, a visitor, or part of the Westland business community. When selecting our nomination for this honor, we compared officers to this mission. Officer Robert Schurig was our fit. Officer Robert Schurig has grown and matured before our eyes. He is a leader on the shift. During a critical incident, you want Officer Schurig on scene. His calm demeanor, he thinks on his feet to deal with any rapid evolving situation. The greatest attribute of a leader is the ability to lead peers. Officer Schurig does just that. He leads, advises, and mentors. His peers have great respect for his leadership abilities, knowledge base, and his communication skills. This confidence led to his selection as the president of the Westland Police Officers Association. For self-improvement, he is always willing to have after-action reviews of incidents. He takes feedback to heart to improve his own policing skills. He keeps current on relevant changes to laws and department policies and procedures. Officer Schurig is consistently a leader in proactive policing. He is always on the top percentage of our department for felony arrests, for misdemeanor arrests, and for citations. Throughout this ceremony, you heard of several examples of excellent police work that Officer Schurig did in 2020. His uncanny ability to find crime afoot has taken many dangerous offenders off the street, several weapons, and large quantities of narcotics that negatively affect our community. In addition, he has shown compassion and bravery in helping several people who have had the intent to harm themselves. It is with great confidence and honor that we selected Officer Robert Schurig as the 2020 Westland Police Officer of the Year.
Thank you, Chief. I would like to thank the Chief, Jed Rusick, for selecting me for this award. I am honored to have been chosen, and sure, it was not an easy decision, as there is great police work done every day by the officers in this department. I would like to thank my wife, my daughters, parents, and my in-laws for all the support they have given and continue to give me. I'm lucky to have a job I love doing and great co-workers that I'm able to do it with. I'm looking forward to my future at this department, and I just want to again thank you all for this honor.
On behalf of the Westland Police Department, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch tonight's presentation. Just as in 2020, the Westland Police Department will continue to work hard towards ensuring the safety of you and every member of our community in the year 2021.